and 9:30 p.m. Eastern and Pacific.
Now the hearing on U.S. policy toward Taiwan's security. Earlier today, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee heard from Assistant Secretary of State Stanley Roth, former CIA Director James Woolsey, former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, and others. The hearing was chaired by Senator Jesse Helms. It lasts 2 hours and 15 minutes.
Committee will come to order, and we have an array of distinguished witnesses today, a full schedule, and on behalf of the committee, I extend our welcome to each and every one of them. The first being Senator Balkus, Max Balkus, who is known to all of us. Then also, as is Assistant Secretary Roth, Deputy Assistant Secretary Campbell, our private panelists. We are genuinely grateful to all of you for coming today. Specifically, our purpose is to examine S-693, the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act, which Senator Torricelli and I introduced sometime earlier this year. I think it was in March. This legislation will ensure that Taiwan will have the essential self-defense capabilities. And to accomplish that, we propose to bolster the process for defense sales to Taiwan and help Taiwan achieve and maintain an adequate military readiness. Now, the need to enhance our defense relationship with Taiwan, I think, is obvious. First, the reunification of Taiwan has become an increasingly high agitation issue for Beijing now that they have reabsorbed Hong Kong and, as of this coming December, Macau. Secondly, Beijing constantly demonstrates a willingness to use intimidation to achieve its goals. China fired missiles off Taiwan's coast in 1995-96 and is now engaged in a massive missile buildup opposite Taiwan, according to the February 1999 Pentagon report to Congress. Beijing is also undergoing a multifaceted military buildup, which includes increased emphasis on logistical improvements for a Taiwan scenario. And if one adds to this buildup the ugly, threatening rhetoric aimed at Taiwan by the highest levels of the Chinese government, one can see the very real threat that Taiwan may face. Third, part of Beijing's strategy is to continue its pressure on the United States to limit or cease arms sales to Taiwan, and this has had the effect of at various times on successive administrations in this country. Of course, it was the Reagan administration that signed the regrettable 1982 communique, which set a ceiling on arms sales to Taiwan and promised China that we would gradually reduce these sales. Over the years, the United States has refused to sell Taiwan needed defense items such as submarines, missiles, solely to assuage China. And just 2 weeks ago, the Clinton administration withheld several arms sale notifications to Congress and is reported to be considering further such measures in an obvious attempt to curry favor with Beijing and punish Taiwan for President Lee's recent remarks on Taiwan's status. And lastly, our friends in Taiwan have military capability that has operated in virtual isolation for more than 20 years. Taiwan's military does not conduct joint exercises with the U.S. military and is not even able to observe many of our exercises. No U.S. officers above the rank of colonel or Navy captain can go to Taiwan, and those who do are limited in the things they can do and say. This has certainly had a corrosive effect on Taiwan's military preparedness at exactly the time Taiwan faces a growing military threat from China. So the United States strategic interest, the United States law, and United States moral values dictate, it seems to me, that we assist our longtime friends on Taiwan in meeting these challenges, and that is why Senator Torricelli and I have introduced this bill. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses, but first, I look forward to hearing from Senator Biden.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we occasionally need an important bill like this to both attract the caliber of witnesses you've assembled today, as well as to prove to people that we don't agree on everything. Because of late, that's been the case. Mr. Chairman, let me first commend you for holding this hearing to examine S693, the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act, and let me also welcome the very distinguished panel of witnesses. I look forward to hearing each of their testimony. As some in this hearing room may know, the Chairman and I are among a handful of current members of the Senate who were here to vote for the Taiwan Relations Act or against it 20 years ago. As I've said many times before, over the past 20 years, there's been no member of the Senate who's been more loyal friend of Taiwan than the Chairman. Like the Chairman, I too am proud of my vote 20 years ago to help pass the Taiwan Relations Act, and the TRA has helped preserve, in my view, peace and stability in the Western Pacific, creating an environment in which Taiwan has thrived. Taiwan today is an economically and culturally vibrant multi-party democracy, and Taiwan's transformation, I think, would not have been possible without the United States' commitment to its security as enshrined in the TRA. China should have no doubt that our commitment remains firm. The United States believes China and Taiwan should settle their differences peacefully through dialogue on the basis of mutual respect. Mr. Chairman, it's precisely because I share your commitment to Taiwan's security and to the Taiwan's Relations Act as a law of the land that I have such grave reservations about the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act, which is subject to today's hearing. Far from enhancing Taiwan's security, I'm concerned that passage of this legislation would be the equivalent of waving a red cape in front of Beijing and inviting China to charge. First, there is no security measure included in this act that is precluded by the Taiwan Relations Act, the TRA. Let me repeat that. Nothing contemplated in S693 is prohibited by the TRA. In fact, several of the enhancements suggested in the bill, such as increased military exchanges, better access to U.S. military schools, improved missile defense, airborne early warning aircraft, advanced medium-range air-to-air missile technology, anti-submarine warfare equipment, etc., are already part of the administration's security policy toward Taiwan. Recent U.S. defense sales to Taiwan have included 150 F-16 fighters, advanced Patriot missile batteries, Perry and Knox-class frigates, the E-2T airborne early warning aircraft. Of course, some aspects of our security relationship are not publicized very much, and that's as it should be, in my opinion. But as a result of the low-profile, results-oriented approach, some members of Congress and the public may get the mistaken impression that the U.S. is neglecting Taiwan. In my view, nothing could be further from the truth. Few people, for instance, know that Taiwan's Chief of General Staff, a four-star general who is currently Taiwan's defense minister, visited Washington last October to meet with Secretary of Defense Cohen. 3- and 4-star generals routinely visit the Pentagon and other military installations, usually with very little hoopla. My second concern is that the bill's mistaken conclusion that Taiwan's security is primarily a function of its military capabilities. While it is true that deterrence is a significant component of Taiwan's security, in my view, the reality is that no amount of weaponry alone can guarantee Taiwan's security. Taiwan's security, in my view, flows from its democratic form of government, its growing economic, cultural, and political contacts with the mainland, and ultimately the United States' abiding commitment to a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan question. In my opinion, we should concentrate on strengthening those areas rather than spend time pre-authorizing the sales of weapon systems, some of which don't even exist yet. None of the authorizations included in Section 5 of the bill, as I read the bill, is necessary in my view. The administration already has all the authority it needs under the TRA to sell such defensive weapon systems to Taiwan as are deemed necessary to meet Taiwan's legitimate defense needs. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm convinced and concerned that the timing of this bill is very ill-timed. U.S. relations with China leave a lot to be desired at the moment, to say the very least. And as Taiwan's defense minister told a visiting staff member of the committee 2 months ago, poor U.S.-China relations are bad news for cross-strait relations, for Taiwan-Chinese relations. There's no single issue with greater potential to bring the U.S. and China into conflict than Taiwan. And a surefire way to spark such a conflict is for the U.S. to reinforce the growing perception in Beijing, however mistakenly it may be, that the U.S. is hostile to China or pursuing the fragmentation of China. President Lee Dong-Wei's July 9 statement that China and Taiwan should conduct their affairs on the basis of a special state-to-state, and that's the quote, special state-to-state, end of quote, relations, has rattled Beijing and injected a measure of uncertainty about Taiwan's future into the cross-straits dynamic. Now is not the time for the U.S. to add to that uncertainty by modifying the very foundation upon which 6 successive U.S. administrations have constructed their Chinese policy. We should follow the old maxim, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Mr. Chairman, I think this is premature. I understand your intentions. I believe they are obviously well-intended. There's nothing in the act that would preclude anything that you're contemplating from going forward. I think we should let things simmer down a little bit rather than heat up. And I thank the chair for his indulgence.
Very well. Senator Baucus called me or visited me on the floor the other day and said he wanted to comment on this in opposition to the bill, and we welcome him. He suggested 5 to 7 minutes, but we're going to turn on the red light at 10 minutes. Give you a little extra, Senator Baucus. We're glad to have you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate your courtesy, as well as that of Senator Biden, all the rest of the committee, and I'll be less than 10 minutes. I know you have a full agenda, so I'll be very brief. I, Mr. Chairman, share the motivation underlying the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act. I, too, am concerned about the security and stability of Taiwan. But I believe that this is the wrong approach at the wrong time. The One China policy has served the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, the United States, and the world very well for over a quarter of a century. It has led to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait in the region. In Taiwan, we have seen the development of a flourishing and vibrant democracy, a prosperous and dynamic high-tech economy envied by the entire world, and security. In the PRC, we have seen the opening up to the West, double-digit economic growth, or more responsible involvement in global affairs, liberalizing trends domestically, and security. For the United States, we've gotten over a quarter of a century of stability in Asia, the maintenance of workable relations with both the PRC and Taiwan, and the ability to influence both the PRC and Taiwan in the direction of modernity and responsibility on the world scene. And the world has seen peace, stability, and economic prosperity in the region. There are some who criticize the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 communiques. They say that this framework is simply an artifact of the Cold War, an artifact that is irrelevant with the end of the Soviet Union and the enormous political and economic changes in Taiwan. I see no alternative at the present time to this framework that we have helped so much to construct. It is not perfect, it is not neat, but it has benefited everyone, and at least in the near term, there is nothing better. Over the long term, I believe that the current framework will not be sustainable, but change and adjustment must be done with great care and great caution. There can be no unilateral redefinition. The message that we in the United States have given to Beijing and Taipei from the beginning of the normalization process has been that they must negotiate together to resolve their differences. Settlement must be found by peaceful means, and there should be no unilateral steps taken to change the situation. That message is the same today. I want to take a moment to commend President Clinton for his active role that he has taken in trying to calm things down between Taipei and Beijing. I was extremely glad that the President called Chinese President Jiang Zemin to encourage restraint. His public comments, as well as his dispatch of Assistant Secretary Roth to Beijing and the IT Director Bush to Taipei, have helped. What is needed now, more than ever, is dialogue across the Taiwan Strait. Dialogue without Taiwan attempting to change the framework unilaterally, and dialogue without the PRC making belligerent threats, taking military action, or trying in other ways to squeeze Taiwan. Let me conclude with a few comments about the WTO. The PRC is the world's most populous country. Taiwan is the 12th largest economy in the world. It makes no sense to have them outside the WTO. The Taiwan agreement is finished. The Chinese agreement almost done. I urge Beijing to come back to the negotiating table now and complete the agreement quickly. The Congress can then approve permanent NTR, and we will see both Taipei and Beijing committed to the WTO this fall. A peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue is deeply in the interest of all parties and of the entire region. We must avoid confrontation, which would inevitably draw the United States into it in some way. It is a delicate balance across the Taiwan Strait, and I don't believe that the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act is the way to maintain peace, stability, and continued economic growth in the region. Again, Mr. Chairman and Sir Biden, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my thoughts to the committee today, and I urge you to do what's right, and that is maintain peace and the continuation of the one China policy.
Thank you, Senator. I noticed you abbreviated your statement somewhat. Without objection, the full statement that has prepared will appear in the record. Now, I've just been advised that there will be a vote on the floor at 5 minutes past 11. But let's get started with panel two, rather. Honorable Stanley O. Roth, whom all of us know, Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and Dr. Kurt Campbell, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs. Secretary, why don't you proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you again. I want to start on a completely different topic, but just to give you a very short briefing because I know it's a high priority for you. I was in Vietnam last week for consultations, and I wanted to let you know that I put at the top of my meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also Foreign Minister, the continuing issues concerning the Montagnards that you and I have discussed before,
right,
and in particular the question of visas so they can be reunited in the United States. And so I wanted you to know that this remains a high priority issue for the administration, not just for you.
Well, I appreciate that. Is it your opinion that maybe the situation is becoming a bit better?
The situation is becoming a bit better, but it's not good enough, and I think we should continue to press to make it a lot better. They're both in terms of issues relating to NGO access to the areas themselves and benefits for the people living there. There's been some progress, including the fact that members of your staff were given a visa, but that's not a substitute for better treatment of these people. There's been some progress on the visa issue. Many cases have been reviewed, but not all of them, and there's still several hundred cases of individuals that are pending where we haven't heard back from Vietnam, and I indicated that this was not acceptable and we needed their help in getting these cases resolved expeditiously, that this was a humanitarian problem. I pointed out that this was a high priority for you, but I indicated it was also a high priority for the administration. So I don't want to use too much time, but I did want to let you know that this happened just last week.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. Let's never forget that these are people who supported the United States when we needed support the most in the world, and now they're being kicked around, and I'm encouraged by your remarks, but please do just hang in there.
Yes.
You may proceed.
Okay. In terms of the issue at hand, what I thought I would do is briefly review the context in which this legislation needs to be considered, and then offer remarks about the legislation itself.
Right.
Obviously, the world has changed enormously since we last had a hearing on this subject on March 25th. At that time, you may recall that I was cautiously optimistic. That was because the cross-straits dialogue had taken a historic step forward with the so-called Wang-Ku meetings, and another round was scheduled, and it appeared that both parties on either side of the strait were talking to each other, and that such a dialogue held out the hopes for progress. Obviously, the situation has turned in a different direction, beginning with the series of events on July 9th, when Lee Teng-hui made his interview concerning special state-to-state relations. In my testimony, I have outlined the chronology of what has happened back and forth between the two parties. But in the interest of time, since those facts are well known, I will not go over that now. I thought what I would do instead is concentrate first on U.S. policy. I want to make it very clear that the administration at every level, from the president on down to your humble servants, have made exactly the same 3 points to both parties. There are 3 pillars of the administration policy. First, the administration's commitment to a one-China policy is unchanged. Regardless of the position of the parties, we have not changed our policy. The president has said that both publicly and privately. Second, we believe that the best means to resolve these issues is by direct dialogue between the parties themselves. We have taken every opportunity, including on my own trip to Beijing last week with Ken Lieberthal from the NSC, to urge the PRC to continue this dialogue. It strikes us that it's precisely when times are difficult that you need the dialogue, and to cancel it because of disagreements would be a mistake. China has not yet indicated whether or not these talks will continue in the fall, as had been previously anticipated, but they've put out a lot of hints suggesting that it wouldn't take place, and we are urging them to continue with this dialogue. Third, a point that is integral to our position, we have stressed again at every opportunity the importance of a peaceful resolution of this issue, and the President has made that absolutely clear, as did Secretary Albright in her meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Tang in Singapore last week, as did Ken Lieberthal and I in our meetings in Beijing. So China can have no doubts about what the United States position is with respect to peaceful resolution of this issue. And of course, the administration has a track record on this point, which you're well aware of. So where does this leave us, given all the toing and froing that has taken place between the parties and this clear exposition of U.S. views? And I think the unfortunate answer is the situation remains tense and potentially dangerous, that we do not know if the dialogue will continue. There are continuing efforts, particularly on the Taiwan side, to try to clarify their position. We saw an effort yesterday in the Financial Times with a statement by Suu Kyi, and we hope that the parties will work out a formula between themselves to get the dialogue back on track. Thus far, we do not see any indication that there is mobilization on the PRC side for military response. That is, as of today, it's very important from our perspective that that remain the case in the future, and that the China not change its mind. We do not want to see a military response, and we've made that absolutely clear. But what we do not know is whether our efforts to encourage both sides to engage in this dialogue, and if our warnings not to engage in military activities will work. So this is, as some of the previous speakers have indicated, a dangerous period of time. One more point, and then I'll relate all this to your legislation. There has been a lot of talk, some allegations that the administration is somehow pressuring Taiwan. And some people cite the fact that I was sent to Beijing and that Richard Bush was sent to Taipei as proof of this pressure. I want to say, Mr. Chairman, frankly, I'm a bit surprised by this. Had I been sent to Beijing and had nobody been sent to Taipei, I think the argument would have been that was tilting, that we would have been seen as leaning towards China and not even talking to the Taiwans. In fact, Richard Bush and I were dispatched with identical messages in terms of what we sent to the two sides. And our mission, in addition to listening to what our respective interlocutors had to say, was simply to relay what U.S. policy is so that there could be no mistake and the parties understood what we stand for. And that's what we did. But I don't think that constitutes pressure. We have lived up to our obligations. We always had the intention of proceeding with the Taiwan arms sales before the congressional recess. There was not a single conversation that I was privy to or heard about where there was talk of punishment that I've never heard. You've been around long enough to remember the famous 1970s reassessment of policy towards the Middle East when there was a desire to pressure Israel through arms sales. Nothing like that was contemplated, to my knowledge, anywhere in the U.S. government. And we have come up with those arms sales before the notifications, before the recess. So I'm here today to categorically reject the notion that there has been one-sided administration tilt or unfair pressure on Taiwan. We have been scrupulously neutral in our positions in terms of saying what U.S. policy is identical to each side. Now, let me turn to the legislation itself. I do this with some trepidation, Mr. Chairman, because it is not a pleasant position to be in to have to tell the chairman of this committee that the administration strongly imposes a piece of legislation that he has personally authored. Nevertheless, that is the administration's position.
The Bush administration never had trouble telling us that. I mean, don't feel so bad.
I think the chairman deserves some deference. But in any case, let me lay out the arguments and permit us to get to the question and answer period. I think there are two fundamental points and then a number of specifics. But what I'd like to do in my oral remarks is concentrate on the fundamental points which actually have been made by Senator Biden in his opening remarks. First, I believe the biggest fundamental flaw in the legislation is that it focuses on the narrow military aspects of the relationship and assumes that that is the basis for Taiwan's security. Obviously, having a strong defensive capability on Taiwan's part is important. A weak Taiwan might send the wrong signal to the other side and encourage activities that we don't want to see. But having said that, there is also the reality that a military solution alone for an island of 22 million people facing a nation of 1.3 billion people is a rather difficult proposition. And Taiwan's security is not simply a matter, or even primarily a matter, of hardware and of the balance of forces in that sense. I think that the geopolitical situation is actually the critical determinant. By that I mean several things. Obviously, the relationship across the straits between Taiwan and China has a huge impact on the security of Taiwan, and that is why we have pressed so hard for the cross-straits dialogue, because that is the mechanism to resolve these issues peacefully. Second, the U.S. relationship with the PRC is critical, because, as Senator Biden mentioned, it is precisely when U.S.-PRC relations are strong that history has shown that China-PRC relations prosper and that U.S.-Taiwan relations prosper. It is not only not a zero-sum game, it's the opposite. So Taiwan's security is really a complex equation that only partially depends on the hardware, but depends far more on the overall environment. And the question then is, at this dangerous moment of high tensions, would the passage of this legislation, which seeks to change the rules of the game, be beneficial for that environment, or would it be more likely to provoke a response that would hurt Taiwan? I think I can say with no false, without any hype here, Mr. Chairman, that Taiwan has no better friend in the United States than you, and I think your only intention offering this legislation is to help promote Taiwan's security. But the administration's judgment is that this legislation not only won't do that, but would endanger that. And that is why we're opposing it, because we think it could risk a dangerous response from the other side, however unjustified that response might be. The other fundamental point that I wanted to make goes back to the "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" argument that Senator Biden made. I believe the record demonstrates that the Taiwan Relations Act has worked very well. We have, under the Clinton administration, a very robust policy of implementation of this act. Dr. Campbell will provide some of the details in terms of what we've done in terms of defensive weaponry sales and other steps. But I think that this process, our arms sales dialogue process, is working, despite the fact that we have disagreement over several systems. But it really isn't broken. In fact, the overall relationship has helped to promote a situation that is radically better than where we were 20 years ago when this act was adopted. Since I already testified in March at great detail about that, I won't go through that lengthy argument again, other than to say that the degree of ties between Taiwan and the PRC that exists today were inconceivable 20 years ago. The cross-straits dialogue was inconceivable 20 years ago. And the atmosphere of peace and stability that enabled Taiwan to get so prosperous and to democratize was inconceivable 20 years ago. These are all accomplishments of the TRA, which continues to work. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Beyond that, in my testimony, I have laid out some very specific objections to individual provisions in the bill. It's your call, Mr. Chairman. I can do that now or respond in Q&A, depending on whether you'd like me to finish before the vote.
Fine. Mr. Secretary, you are a very articulate man. But I would point out, if you'll check the transcript a little bit later, you may want to adjust that. You put all the blame on the President's speech, Lee. You didn't say anything about the saber rattling of Beijing. You didn't say anything about the threats. I think the facts are that Beijing is a belligerent bully, jealous and envious of what Taiwan has accomplished. Mr. Secretary? You're not a secretary, you are. Yes, you are.
I wish I was. I think it's the way. I think that's the way.
Sometimes I get it right.
Probably not after this one. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be able to appear before you, and I think Assistant Secretary Roth has given you a broader, I think very accurate foreign policy representation of the cross-strait situation. What I'd like to do this morning is to speak specifically and very briefly on the security issues. First of all, I'd like to very quickly associate myself with much of what Senator Biden has said. I think it's very accurate and very clear. One thing in particular that I'd like to draw attention to, in which he talked about the security dynamic between the United States and Taiwan as being one that has been low-profile, results-oriented approach that best be done quietly. And I'd like to associate myself with that. I think I've been part of that, and I think it's been very successful. I would say just very briefly that I think the Taiwan Relations Act is the most successful piece of legislative leadership in modern history in the foreign policy realm. I think it's been enormously effective in not only securing peace and stability, but an active U.S. role in the preservation of peace and stability in the Western Pacific. And I also agree that it gives us every bit of authority we need to maintain peace and stability. And I think that's the key. The Taiwan Relations Act gives us what we need to maintain peace and stability. Very briefly, in terms of your bill, the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say quickly that it is, as Secretary Roth indicated, a very delicate time, potentially even a dangerous time. And I think it behooves us to move very carefully in this context. And what I'm worried about are the unintended consequences of the bill. And my judgment, I think the judgment of the Department of Defense, is that the unintended consequences are likely to be dangerous. And so I would urge the committee to indeed re-embrace the Taiwan Relations Act, which I think, as has been already indicated, has served our interests and the interests of Taiwan so very well for these last 20 years. Since I know you have a vote, I can conclude here, and then, as Mr. Roth indicated, I can take any questions about systems or discussions about the broader security implications or ramifications of what we're facing now subsequently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Why don't you go vote when the light comes on, and then I'll go last.
Okay.
Good. Mr. Secretary Roth, the second part of Section 3B of Taiwan Relations Act says that determinations of defense sales to Taiwan should be based solely on our, meaning the President and Congress, judgment of the needs of Taiwan. Now, I read that to mean if Taiwan has a valid military requirement for something based on the threat it faces, we should approve that sale. In other words, political factors such as the opinion of dictators in Beijing shouldn't be a consideration. Do you differ with my interpretation?
If you're asking me, is the criterion for an arms sale whether China approves it or not, the answer clearly is no, that would be illegal, but it would also be bad policy, that China opposes all arms sales to Taiwan. And as you know, the administration position is we not only abide by our obligations under the TRA to provide defensive weaponry, but we believe that's the correct policy. So we do look at it from the point of view of what Taiwan needs for self-defense. That, however, is a complicated calculation as to what goes into that, and we sometimes differ with Taiwan in terms of what their needs are. So I wouldn't go to the opposite extreme and say if mere fact that Taiwan asks for it means that we agree that they should receive it.
Well, could you tell me then why there was so much agitation at the State Department? They had the nervous jeebies in opposition to providing Taiwan with an early warning radar, which merely would give the citizens of Taiwan a few minutes warning that a missile was headed their way. Why did you get so excited about that at the State Department?
Well, let me go back to what I said previously. First of all, it was always our intention to approve this package of arms sales prior to the recess. And I think there's been a lot of unnecessary concern that this was going to be blocked somehow by a pro-Beijing State Department that was going to sell out our obligations to Taiwan. And I've tried to say categorically that that's not the case. There are concerns relating to a very different set of issues, Mr. Chairman, which is the larger set of issues relating to theater missile defense and ballistic missile defense and the whole range of systems that could be contemplated under that category. And there has been a lot of consideration about what should or should not be provided at what point. That is a whole different set of issues where there has been a lot of discussion and no decisions. So I don't want to mislead you. But in terms of the narrow specific sale that has now been notified, there was no guerrilla warfare from the State Department.
Well, is the State Department now committed to providing this early warning to Taiwan?
You're referring to the planes that were just notified.
Pardon?
Let me defer that to Mike.
You have approved it, but you haven't notified. Is that what you're saying?
I think I'm thinking of the sale we just notified. Let me defer to Dr. Campbell.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's been a slight bit of a confusion. If you're talking about the early warning radar discussions that were held earlier this year, our understanding, of course, is that the administration agrees that Taiwan has a need for an appropriate early warning radar system. We have begun both intensive technical review, both internally and with Taiwan authorities, and we anticipate making final decisions at next year's arms talks. And that's been notified both to all parties on Capitol Hill, and it's been informed to our interlocutors in Taiwan as well. And I will tell you, I think that is a unified decision that the administration has taken. It's unfair to characterize it as opposition within the State Department. I've been part of those discussions. The discussions are intense in terms of talking about what's appropriate. Remember, we've never provided these kinds of systems really to any country before. There are a lot of technical issues associated with releasability. I'm comfortable that we've made the right decision, and we're in the midst of very, as I said, intense both internal deliberations and also discussions with Taiwan as we speak.
Well, I'm a little bit confused. You said you have advised, informed Taiwan. And then I understood that you were in the process of deciding. What did you advise Taiwan about?
We advised them that we agreed that there is a need for an early warning capability and an early warning capability associated with the radar system. But remember, as I said, Mr. Chairman, we've never had to consider this kind of request from any country before.
Okay.
And so the technical issues are very difficult. And so we
I'm
gave
just about up. Just a second. Now, in other words, the State Department is taking the view that the April agreement is a commitment to provide the early warning radar. Is that right?
Let me apologize for the confusion I may have just created since I misunderstood the original question and thought it applied to the sale that has already been notified. In terms of now that I understand the question, the position is exactly as Dr. Campbell has represented it. We have made a determination that a capability is needed for early warning, and we have agreed to address it in the context of next year's consultations with Taiwan. We have not worked out all the specifics, but we have had the decision in principle that a capability is needed, and we'll be working on that, and we'll be consulting with the Hill. But we have not made a definitive decision notified to the Congress yet on a specific system.
But you still got them dangling on the string because they don't know what you're going to do. I'm sure you did advise them that you're thinking about it. Senator Biden.
Thank you very much. Let me make sure I understand about the radars. What we're talking about is a land-based radar that's part of the TMD, or maybe.
No, in fact, Senator Biden, not to interrupt you,
Don't interrupt me. I want to get it straight.
This is a system that is designed or will be designed for early warning, exactly as the chairman indicated. Right?
No, I understand that, but but they have E2s now, and you've agreed to sell them more E2s, right?
Yes.
So it's not like they're blind now, right?
That's correct.
That's correct.
All right. Now, look, since there's a vote on, there's not much time. One of the things I think that has prompted, and this is me speaking not for the chairman, and the chairman will correct me if I'm wrong. I think one of the reasons that has prompted this, one of the things that prompted this legislation is not merely Taiwan or the PRC's saber rattling or placement of systems aimed at Taiwan, additional systems. I think much of it has to do with whether or not there is a belief on the part of those who introduced the legislation whether this president will in fact give everything that Taiwan needs, legitimately needs for its defense. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's what it's about. Nobody argues nobody argues that I've heard so far, and I'm anxious to hear the next panel, that everything that is contemplated in this legislation is allowed in the existing in the existing Taiwan's Relation Act. And so obviously there's something here. This is kind of like a pre-approval, and what it's all about, as I see it, is putting the administration, from the perspective of those who think it's not doing enough, in the position of having to do what the Congress would like it to do, and they're afraid the administration won't do. Now, I know that is, I'm in the minority, so I can afford to not be taken seriously, and I can say things that, maybe I wouldn't say were I chairman. But the bottom line is there's a lack of trust here. Just like some of us didn't trust the Reagan administration, and what they told us, a lot of folks here don't trust the Clinton administration and what you all are telling them. One of the questions I have for you, Mr. Roth, is that would you be prepared to commit, and this may not be enough to stem the tide here to pass this legislation, but would you be prepared to, would you consider communicating to the administration that if they were prepared to consult with the appropriate committees up here prior to an arms sale, not for the normal reasons. Usually we seek prior consultation because we may not want an administration to transfer certain arms. Here it's the flip. Here the flip is that you come up here with a plate full of goodies that are going to be sent to Taiwan in an arms sale, and the likelihood is you're going to have people here saying, why isn't there more on the plate? And so, as an alternative here, would you take back the message that there should, in my view, be some consideration to more and advanced consultation with this committee, assuming this act doesn't become law, either because there's not sufficient votes or it's vetoed and there's no ability to override the veto, to be able to come back here to this committee and the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committees and say, look, this is what we intend. Do you all think we should do more? Make your case to us before we do what we now do. We make an internal decision. We inform you of that decision. I absolutely think that just as you say cross-strait discussions are important in dialogue, up-street, down-street relations are important here, because the bottom line of all this is, I think it's being driven by the fact that there's a concern that this administration will not do all that it is called for to do, that is, stand with Taiwan, consistent with the Taiwan's Relation Act that was voted 20 years ago. Would you consider delivering that message and be willing to get back to us, at least to me, and the committee to determine whether or not you're willing to enhance that consultation?
Well, of course we will take the message back.
Well, let me put it another way. If you all don't do it, you're all going to get what you don't want. So take some advice from a guy who may not know much about the politics of this place. Get smart. Quick. Otherwise, the boss is going to win. And it's not a good idea he win this one. Okay? I'm going to go vote before I get myself in more trouble, Mr. Chairman.
You're not in any trouble.
All right.
There'll be about 5 minutes. We have to do this in tandem now. When the United States sent aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait in 1996, were there secure communications directly between the U.S. and Taiwan? Either one of you.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Taiwan Relations Act specifies that dialogue, both on political and security issues, be handled through AIT, our representatives in Taipei.
So the answer is no, is that right?
If I can, let me just finish if I can, Mr. Chairman. That office does have classified capabilities and secure communications. They were used extensively during that crisis. But let me just underscore, those are Americans in that office. And so the message was then subsequently passed from AIT to Taiwan officials. I would say, and just underscore to you, during that time we did have extensive discussions with AIT. Yes.
Okay. Gee, I'm all alone here, and I'm enjoying this now. Mr. Secretary Roth, the Secretary of Energy recently visited Taiwan, is that correct?
Yes.
But why does the State Department continue to limit the rank of military officers who can visit Taiwan?
Well, it's not a question of the rank of military officers. There's a whole government-wide policy that includes the State Department that, in terms of...
I understand that, and I'm asking you why.
Yeah. The answer is that we approve those visits at any level that we believe are consistent with an unofficial relationship. President Clinton made the determination in his first term that since we had a robust economic relationship and that the PRC had a robust economic relationship with Taiwan, that it was appropriate for economic officials up to the level of cabinet rank as appropriate to visit Taiwan. And so under that policy, several economic officials, including Secretary Richardson, have gone. At the same time, the decision was made to continue the policy of all the preceding administrations that senior diplomatic officials, including my level and up at the State Department, and senior military officials, I believe above the level of 06, would not, as that would be more indicative of an official relationship, which we do not have. That has been the rationale.
You know what you're saying to me in plain language? This government is a bunch of nervous nellies afraid that they will offend mainland China. That's what I get out of all of this. And I don't like it, and sure that Joe has referred to my working on this bill that's before us. But I think morality has got to enter this somehow in terms of our attitudes toward governments. Here you have a nation which is cutthroat in its economic dealings with the rest of the world. You find out how much grain they bought from us and all that sort of thing, and how they've done it on the basis of prices and so forth and so on. But a nation that does its political prisoners the way Red China does, blood type them and find out what kind of heart they have and so forth, and then people with $40,000 American money can go in there, and if they match the heart, they can pay the $40,000, and yet the heart, after the political prisoner has been taken out in the yard and shot in the head. Now, I would be just as hard on Taiwan or any other nation, that sort of thing. It has been incident after incident. I deal constantly with young Chinese students in this country. They're not Taiwan people. They are from mainland China, but they are here and they are free, they feel, to say what they believe. Do you ever talk to them?
Certainly. I have met with...
What do they tell you?
Well, each individual generally tells me their saga of, what their problem was with the Chinese government, and they give me their assessment of the situation.
Well, I know that. I know that.
They obviously are extremely critical of the human rights practices of China.
But I am talking about these kids are disgusted with their own country and its moral practices. And we stand back, we don't see a thing, don't smell a thing. And Taiwan, if Taiwan goes down the tube, well, that's just too bad. I tell you, I'm in a fix that I'm going to miss a vote if I let me do this, let me declare a recess for just a minute or two. Paul Coverdale will come back and he will preside. I want the other members of the committee to have a chance to talk with you, but...
and I'd like to respond to some of your comments, too, once you're back.
Pardon me?
I'd like to respond to some of your observations when you've returned.
Right. That's fair enough. The committee will stand in recess momentarily.
I apologize to the panelists, as does the chairman, the unpredictable nature of the Senate. Both you, Mr. Secretary, and Dr. Campbell referred to the opening statement of Senator Biden often and frequently, and in particular to the statement, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Excuse me. It strikes me that there's at least the nature of incongruity here. If you have a Washington Post editorial this morning, the opening paragraph, in just the past few days, China has illegally seized a Taiwanese ship, sent jet fighters provocatively across the Taiwan Strait, repeatedly hurled threats at Taiwan and its elected president, and test-fired a new ballistic missile built in part with stolen U.S. technology. It also has cracked down on a peaceful spiritual sect, rounding up hundreds of members for some old-fashioned communist re-education, and has on Monday sentenced 2 pro-democracy activists to terms of 8 and 9 years in prison on charges of subverting state power. The editorial goes on, is substantially critical of the administration, and this comes to another one of your statements, Secretary Roth, implying in general that there's reinforcement of a world bully and turning a back on a world ally, general nature of it. You've protested that as an incorrect characterization of the administration's policy, but nevertheless, for whatever reason, there seems to be a growing perception that this is reflective of the administration because it's being read and said everywhere in the country. So I'd like each of you to, beginning with you, Secretary Roth, to begin with, what do you think's at the base of this misperception, this inability to understand the administration's policy here? And then, if both of you would comment on the suggestion that everything's just fine. It ain't broke. Don't mess with it. It strikes me that, well, I know that you're talking about TRA specific. Nevertheless, we're here today because I think everybody's alarmed.
Sure.
Mr. Secretary.
I welcome this opportunity since I woke up with some dismay to this editorial, which I think was an intellectual hodgepodge, and so I'd like to try to provide the administration's perspective. To say that the Taiwan Relations Act is working in terms of promoting the interests of peace and stability in the Straits is not to say that all is well either with China's internal policies on human rights or in U.S.-China relations. They are distinct issues. And the notion that the administration simply accepts any Chinese behavior is ridiculous. That if you look at our annual human rights report, which China believes is a scathing attack, and it is because that's the situation, we call it as we see it. If you ask about our efforts to try to secure a resolution in the UN Commission on Human Rights in Geneva on an annual basis, despite strenuous PRC opposition, we do it. We do it because it's right, because the situation calls for it, and we regret that other countries haven't chosen to support us. But we've gone ahead anyway. We haven't been intimidated by the opposition of Beijing. We have tried to advance a human rights dialogue with China. The President and the Secretary have pushed hard to try to get them not only to sign but ratify human rights covenants. We have publicly criticized the crackdown on dissidents. We have publicly criticized the crackdown on Falun Gong. So we have not been silent. And the notion that somehow that we are accepting this behavior and linking it to Taiwan, I just don't see the relationship. There are lots of problems in our bilateral relationship with China that we seek to address in a lot of different venues. But that doesn't focus in on the narrow issue of whether or not this particular legislation makes sense and whether it will work. So I hope we can distinguish between the issues. I have been called to testify numerous points, and undoubtedly will again in the future, about various aspects of China policy, whether it's human rights, non-proliferation, Tibet, and so forth. And we have, positions on all of these issues. And so this is not to say that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that there are no problems with China, nor is it to say, coming to the narrow issue, that we're satisfied with the current situation in cross-straits. I think it's very clear by the high-level attention we've given from the President down that we're concerned about the situation in the Straits, and what we're trying to do is make clear that both parties understand just how determined we are to insist on peaceful resolution through dialogue. And that is why the President has made his comments. That's why I was dispatched to Beijing with Ken Lieberthal, why Richard Bush was dispatched to AIT, and why we continue to emphasize these points. It's precisely because things aren't good that we're trying to play our role, which is as the stabilizer, to try to calm the situation down, to urge restraint on the parties, and to get this back in the channel of dialogue. So that is the posture.
Well, first, Dr. Campbell.
Senator, I think you ask a fundamental and extremely difficult question. And I think I was just reflecting on it. I'll try not to give you an overly academic answer, but as I think about it, I believe at the heart of this is we are on the verge of, as many have said, of the Pacific century, which will likely be the Pacific being the most dynamic, important, and potentially the most dangerous area for American foreign policy. And at the center of that is the character and nature of our relationship with China. And I think what you see in the United States are struggles defining what our interests are, what kind of relationship we need to have with China. China, for us, encompasses almost every kind of challenge that a nation can face. It's both a rising power in the international system. That's always hard for those powers that are status quo powers. It has a growing military. It is developing capabilities that we have to look at very carefully. It's not a threat militarily to the United States now, but it could be in the future. It plays an important role in human rights, as Secretary Roth has stated, in proliferation and all matter of regional diplomacy in North Korea, South Asia. It can be the key to peace and stability. It has a system of government, as Chairman Helms has said, that's antithetical to our own. And of course, at the middle of this is this complex relationship vis-a-vis Taiwan. I would tell you that my own sense is that this is going to be one of those issues that will be debated within the context of the American polity for years to come. What's interesting, I think I would just note, is that the divisions don't break down along party lines. You've got divisions within parties. You've got debates on a whole host of issues. I think the administration has done what it can to articulate why it is in U.S. interests to have a relationship with Beijing. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be subject to tremendous criticism, but I think it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do not just because we have key security issues in preserving peace and stability in the Asian-Pacific region, but simply because we can't ignore China. China is going to be with us in the next century, whether we like it or not, and we better adjust to that as soon as possible.
Well, will you acknowledge that on the balance of the public expressions made today, that I don't think all this national conclusion that this administration in these last several weeks been weighted against, it hasn't been a balance. You said, well, we sent representatives to both countries simultaneously, but
With the same message.
with the same message. Something hasn't worked because too much international comment suggesting that it isn't the same message, that it doesn't have an equilibrium to it. Normally this doesn't happen, just falls out of a shoe. If you really believe, and I assume that you do, that it needs to be an equal message to both, do you think that there's any modification called for here, given the analysis that all of us are waking up like you this morning reading, not only in the Washington Post, but across the country?
If you're asking me, do I think there needs to be a modification in administration policy, I would say no. If you're asking me, do I think that the parties on either side of the strait need to continue making efforts to come up with a mutually acceptable formulation that lets them get the dialogue back on track, I would say the answer is yes. What has changed has not been U.S. policy. What has changed has been the policy of the parties out there on either side of the strait. And so I think we have always taken the position, this administration and all our predecessors, that it's between the parties themselves to work out the precise formulas under which they conduct cross-straits dialogue and regulate their own relationships, and we don't get in the middle. We're not a mediator. We're not a negotiator. We don't propose language to them. We're not negotiating this for them, right? But what we have said is the importance on both sides, get to the table, keep to the table, and make progress on working these issues out peacefully. That is the effort that now is still underway out there. As I indicated just yesterday, you saw in Suu Kyi's statement to the Financial Times yet another effort from the Taiwan side to offer a formulation designed to be reassuring, since it again referenced the one China policy. So it's up to the parties to make these formulations and to work it out. And what we have urged them to do is to be flexible and meanwhile urge restraint.
Dr. Campbell, you want to comment on that?
I think the message that I take from the Senate today, Senator, is described, I think, very accurately by Senator Bynum. I think we have to listen very carefully to the message you're giving us today, and I accept it. And I think in terms of consultation and discussion with the Senate, I take it on for myself to do a better job along those lines.
Within appropriate discretion, what is your assessment of the risk level, of the of where we sit right now? I would say that the incidents are not less heated; they're more. And what should we read from this? Is there a misreading of our intentions here? Are we being misjudged on either side or both? Are we in a green situation, a yellow, or red?
Right. Well, you're asking the right questions. I'm not sure I can tell you the right answers, because this depends on the actions of others, and particularly in determinations made by two parties. We have been as clear and as unequivocal as we can be about our determination to see a peaceful resolution. And as I said earlier, we have a track record on this so people know we're serious. And this message has been communicated privately as well as publicly. But what you're asking me is, will this be sufficient? And that requires me to speak for other governments, which I cannot do. And so all I can say is that we have laid down every marker that we know how to lay down about the seriousness with which we take this issue. And that meanwhile, we continue in specific terms to call for restraint. You undoubtedly saw the press article yesterday about the flights, the sorties that are being conducted by both sides, approaching the median line in the Straits. And we have made not one, not two, but 6-day marches in the past 48 hours in Beijing, in Taipei, in Washington, on the civilian side and on the military side. Again, with the same message to both. Exercise restraint, don't push this to confrontation. The risk of an accident, much less a deliberate confrontation, is high. It's not in your interest, it's not in the other side's interest, and it's not in our interest, and don't do it. So we are trying very actively, this is not a passive administration policy, to push the idea of restraint, but I can't give you an unequivocal guarantee, much as I'd like to, that it's necessarily going to work.
Dr. Campbell?
Senator, I'd put it at yellow. I think, as Assistant Secretary Roth has indicated, both sides tend to use military forces to signal. And I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is that I think both Taiwan and the PRC sometimes believe that they have an ability to signal in ways that the other side understands completely. And I think our experience, certainly during the Cold War and other experiences, indicates that that kind of signaling is often very much misunderstood by the other side. And I think what we worry about are circumstances, again, like Secretary Roth has indicated, are when you've got, forces in proximity trying to signal the other side, look, we mean business, we're serious on whatever particular issue, that there are potentials for accidents and miscalculation. And I would say that the greatest concern that we at the Department of Defense has, and I think the administration has, is for an inadvertent or an accidental act, which frankly leads us back to where Secretary Roth began today, which is the most important thing that can happen is for lines of communication to be reestablished without preconditions. And those lines of communications should be on a range of issues, not least of which we think issues designed to preclude the possibility of this kind of miscalculation or accident. Ultimately, however, it's not our choice. One of the 6 assurances that we provided to Taiwan, and in fact we informed the PRC in the 1980s, is that we will not interfere in their complex diplomacy. And so while we can make suggestions, right, that this kind of mechanism might be useful, we can't insist on it and we can't inject ourselves into it. I think one of the principles that's absolutely clear is that when we become more directly involved in this complex cross-strait security dimension, the potential for instability probably grows rather than is reduced.
Interesting. Senator Kerry?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Obviously a topic of enormous consequence in so many different ways. I find myself exceedingly sympathetic to the chairman of the committee, Senator Helms, and the sentiment that he is expressing. The notion that there ought to be some clarity, but I obviously find myself, maybe not obviously, I find myself sharing the position of Senator Biden and others that the methodology is at least provocative and potentially dangerous. But there's a fine line, clearly, that needs to be walked here. And I wonder if we're walking it correctly, if there isn't something short of what the chairman seeks to do in his legislation, but greater than what is on the table today. Reading your testimony, Mr. Secretary Roth, you say both missions had the same objective. This is in your trips to Taipei and Beijing. To listen to senior leaders to make sure they understood the United States' firm adherence to its long-standing policies, one China, and our insistence on peaceful resolution of differences. Well, the one China part we can all understand. What does it mean, insistence on peaceful resolution of differences? Isn't the ambiguity that has purposefully existed in that, in fact, potentially leading China in the wake of other aspects of the U.S.-China relationship to make some judgments that might push the limits absent some greater clarity to that particular sentence? What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that sentence was chosen to try to reduce, not increase, ambiguity. That the notion is that this is not a mere talking point when we say, if you use the standard rhetoric, and in cross-straits issues, people tend to use the same rhetoric with almost theological significance. So you always say the United States has an abiding interest in the peaceful resolution of these issues. My goal in drafting this sentence was to get away from that, diplomatic language and just make it clear that what we're saying to people is this matters to us, that we take this very seriously. But I've said earlier today, we have a track record about how seriously we take this and understand that this has to be resolved peacefully. So
well, speaking of the track record, Mr. Secretary, and I say this as a devil's advocate, but many people in the Congress today and publicly have written about and argued that the administration has not gotten very much for its constructive engagement policy with China. And the question, therefore, is being asked, are they interpreting, therefore, the track record of the last years and where we currently are in a way that leads them to make some of these decisions
in a way that emboldens them, which then leads Senator Helms and others to believe we have to be more clear about what this means to us and what we might do. Could one follow from the other, logically?
Well, perhaps I was being too diplomatic. When I was referring to the track record, I was talking about our actions in March of 1996. In other words,
you're talking about the upscaling in the Straits.
The deployment of the two carriers in response to what we felt were provocative actions by the PRC that threatened the peace and stability of the region, and consequently, at that point, the administration acted and acted decisively.
So that's the message you want China to clearly understand.
I was serious about peaceful resolution.
Well, is it, in your judgment, I mean, what would you say to those critics who suggest that when you look at the crackdown on dissidents, when you look at, I mean, I don't want to have to run through the whole record, but you know the litany. What's your response to that? That, in fact, you're not getting very much from China, and therefore, your saber rattling in response is hollow.
Well,
again, devil's advocate
I'm not sure
question.
I understand the two linkages. If you're asking me about engagement policy in general with China and whether it's worked, we have always taken the position that this is, designed to achieve results, and that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That it's not engagement qua engagement, but that it's engagement for the sake of making progress on issues. And if it doesn't succeed, then we'll have to try something else. And we have argued, I think with a pretty good case, that in some areas we've made considerable progress, in some areas we've made slight progress, in some areas we haven't made progress. So the record is open, but I certainly would not accept that engagement has failed across the board. I think there's a lot to show for it in some areas quite specifically, including on the nonproliferation side, including on some of our foreign policy areas where we work on North Korea, South Asia, and a few other areas. So I think it's a mixed record. But I don't see how the overall debate about the effectiveness of engagement policy relates to the credibility on cross-straits, where I think there's a very specific, track record of the administration's seriousness on this issue.
And there's, in your judgment, then, there can be no ambiguity in the leaders of China's minds with respect to what that phrase means and what our position is?
I hope not. I can't speak for the leaders of China, but I think we have made our positions very clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just have one question, Mr. Chairman, and I know we have an important panel waiting. China's deployed a large number of short-range missiles opposite Taiwan and may deploy more missiles over the next 5 years. What can and should the U.S. do to increase Taiwan's ability to defend itself from this new threat?
Well, I think the first point is, and the point the administration has emphasized, particularly to the PRC, is that China's actions matter, and that if China is perceived as acquiring major new capabilities, that is going to trigger reasonable demands for U.S. responses. And I have specifically testified here previously, and let me repeat again today, that the administration, has not precluded the sale of TMD to Taiwan, because we're specifically going to have to see, once the systems mature, as Dr. Campbell indicated, whether it's an appropriate response to the threat. But what we said to the PRC is this is the moment for diplomacy. You're supposed to be having cross-straits dialogue, and one of the things that would make the most sense to be talking about with Taiwan would be the whole issue of missiles and TMD. You don't want them to get TMD. They don't want to be threatened by missiles. This is an obvious basis for discussion, and perhaps you two can work something out. If not, our options are open. So that's been the primary response that we have made.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen,
I
thank
would
you
say
very
just one quickly. The key here in the short term is going to be restraint. And it's absolutely critical for the PRC over the next year or two to demonstrate restraint when it comes to the deployment and development of systems across the Taiwan Strait.
But what you going to do if they continue to thumb their noses at you and steal our secrets and make the big B out of them? I think we're scared to death of them.
Well, Mr. Chairman, maybe I can respond to that because I had asked prior to the recess to respond to you, because you've made this statement that this administration is scared to death of them, and this administration does not deal with them on the government level because we're afraid of their response. And even though I know this argument is not going to persuade you, I think it's important for the record to indicate, first of all, every administration since 1979, including 12 years of Reagan and Bush, has had the policy of not having senior diplomats and military officials travel there. This is not a new policy. But furthermore, every major country in the world, every major power in every continent behaves in exactly the same fashion. And the notion that this is simply cowardice on the part of every country in the world and every administration in the U.S. for the last 20 years, I think is not fair. I think this has been a pragmatic formulation that has worked to promote the peace and stability in Taiwan's own interests. And so I think that is the basis for it.
Well, I thank you, gentlemen. It's just a fact that Communist China has not been as belligerent in previous administrations. But I thank you for covering this morning, and we got the home team coming in on the panel now.
Home team.
Excuses. We are honored to have some officials of previous administrations. The Honorable Richard V. Allen, he was one of Ronald Reagan's right-hand men, whom I have known ever since then, very well. And then there's the Honorable Caspar Weinberg, who is a great patriot and a good friend. Dr. David M. Lampton, Director of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And last and certainly not least, Jim Woosley, the former CIA. Since we always begin on the left, I don't know exactly why that is, but
It's a good habit, Mr. Chairman. It's a good habit.
Well, from the other view, it's they're on the right, you see. Excuse me. So, Senator, I wish you were. Mr. Allen, if you'll proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Biden, Senator Coverdell, Senator Kerry, and committee who may come in. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to share my views with you on this important legislation. The United States has long-standing and solemn responsibilities toward Taiwan. This bill is timely and necessary, primarily because the future security of Taiwan has been jeopardized by the policies of the administration and by the words and actions of the President and Secretary of State. Unless the Congress acts promptly to do something, Taiwan's future as the only Chinese democracy may be threatened. The United States needs to have a straightforward, productive, positive, and normal relationship with the People's Republic of China. It's striven to do so. But a sound relationship with China does not mean that this country is obliged to respond to China's demands in a matter absolutely vital to our national security interest in the Pacific Basin, and more important, an obligation that is rooted in the law of the United States. When President Jimmy Carter announced on December 15, 1978, that he intended to establish formal diplomatic relations with the PRC, it came as a great surprise, and especially to Congress. On January 29, 1979, the President sent to Congress a draft bill. It was vague and feckless. The Congress immediately recognized the inherent risks in these Carter proposals and set out to remedy them with tough, unambiguous, and bipartisan language. The final version of the Taiwan Relations Act, completely and dramatically different from Mr. Carter's version, was approved on March 29th, 2 months after its introduction, in the Senate by a vote of 90-6 and the House by 345-55. As Senator Biden noted, both you and he were there to cast that vote. President Carter didn't even try to resist and signed that act on April 10, 1979. The clear intent of Congress was to assert its inherent constitutional powers to remedy a dangerously defective administration approach to a vital national security interest. As one expert put it, Congress as an institution brought all of its foreign affairs authorities to bear in enacting one of the most successful legislative initiatives of foreign policy making in U.S. history. The fundamental changes imposed by Congress conferred great significance on the future of our relationship with Taiwan, especially in providing adequate weapons to Taiwan so that it might defend itself against the only source of future aggression, the People's Republic of China. The PRC insists that its version of the future of Taiwan is the only valid outcome. In its eyes, Taiwan is a renegade province ruled by a non-existent illegal clique, and it has not renounced the use of force to reincorporate Taiwan. We're in a period now of rough sailing in our relations with the People's Republic of China, and there's no question that the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was a monumental blunder, even if it was an accident. It fanned nationalist sentiment and allowed mobs to attack our embassy in retaliation in an ominous signal, not just petulant behavior that would pass by temporarily. Its vituperative attacks in the United States and those who insist that Taiwan's safety represents a vital American interest is unceasing. S-693 makes 20 important findings and then proceeds to direct the Department of State and Defense to make available a variety of defensive weapons that are going to update and modernize Taiwan's ability to defend itself. The administration argues that the Taiwan Relations Act is working and doesn't require adjustment or amplification. The administration also considers 693 to be intrusive by placing unwanted restrictions on the ability of the executive branch to conduct foreign affairs and is congressional micromanagement. These arguments are certainly not valid in the matter of Taiwan security. The Congress has a special, ongoing responsibility to ensure that the law is upheld. If the Taiwan Relations Act were now being implemented fully or faithfully, there would be no need for Congress to exert its prerogatives and to draft S-693 in the first place. In the 6.5 years of the Clinton administration, the effectiveness of the TRA has been slowly eroded, and numbers don't tell the story alone. Notably eroded since the visit of President Clinton to China last June, when he inexplicably embraced Beijing's 3 no's regarding Taiwan. This indeed was an important tilt, a change in U.S. policy. It sent a message, and I believe it was the wrong one. From the outset, Beijing has simply rejected the Taiwan Relations Act as a gross interference in its internal affairs. China repeatedly declares the TRA to be null and void, of no significance whatever. It insists that the 3 communiques are the only basis for the Sino-American relationship. I've heard that argument for years, especially since Deng Xiaoping recited it to George Bush, then candidate for vice president, and me in August of 1980 in a pre-election trip that we took. This, Mr. Chairman, is the nub of the argument. Does the law of the land, the Taiwan Relations Act, take precedence over diplomatic communiques? The administration may think it does not. Finding 11 of S-693 puts it clearly. As has been affirmed on several occasions by the executive branch of government, the provisions of the Taiwan Relations Act take legal precedence over any communique with the People's Republic of China. The administration, I think, misleads the Congress and the American people when it insists that it has been just following the precedents of previous administrations. According to the legal advisor of the State Department in 1982, these communiques do not constitute a treaty or a legally binding obligation, international agreement, creating obligations and rights under international law, but rather are statements of future U.S. policy. I now come to the central point of S-693, the provision of defensive armaments to Taiwan. The very first stated purpose of the Taiwan Relations Act is to help maintain peace, security, and stability in the Western Pacific. The law states that to accomplish this, the President and the Congress shall determine the nature and quantity of such defense articles and services based solely upon their judgment and the needs of Taiwan. The administration really believes that the defense of Taiwan's democracy is hinged to the continuity of its capability to deter war. Why does it threaten to penalize Taiwan by withholding arms transfers and technical cooperation? Why did the Secretary of State make the incredible statement that Taiwanese elaboration of President Lee Teng-hui's July 9th speech doesn't quite do it, as if to put Taiwan in the corner and as if to pressure it to hurry up and sign some interim agreements leading to the reunification with the PRC? Should President Lee Teng-hui issue a full mea culpa and petition Beijing for its understanding? Doesn't this policy stance actually put the United States on the side of the repressive and hostile PRC regime? The same folks who gave us Tiananmen Square, who repress and jail democratic dissidents, who mobilize to crush spiritual movements like the Falun Gong and issue an arrest warrant for its leader who lives in the United States, who systematically violate every principle of human rights, who continue to subjugate Tibet. At what price can we finally achieve or purchase a decent and stable relationship with the People's Republic of China? Some specialists argue that China would be willing to fight the United States over Taiwan either now or soon, and that this new possibility introduces a new dimension to our policy deliberations. It's the dimension of risk, which is inherent in every aspect of our foreign policy and certainly was a characteristic of the Cold War. Risk was the essence of our response to the Soviet Union. Given the pace of China's military power and its buildup, far in excess of its defensive requirements, we must fairly conclude that China anticipates that it will need to project its power in the region, perhaps to displace eventually the United States as the principal determinant of what goes on in the Western Pacific, or to demonstrate sufficient muscle to persuade its neighbors to go along and get along on China's terms. But the most ominous reason, Mr. Chairman, for the accumulation of military power appears to be the prospective subjugation of Taiwan, preferably by threat of force, and in extremis, the actual use of force, while being able to deter the United States from intervening. We need to look at our own capabilities and our long-term strategy. We cannot and should not proceed on the assumption that we will be drawn into conflict with China for any reason, yet neither can we afford to abandon our role or our capabilities in the region. Like all legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act is not frozen in time. S-693 is consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act. It properly elaborates the TRA in strategic conditions that prevail today and into the next decade. It is a response to present needs and is but the continuation of an insurance policy wisely enacted through congressional initiative 20 years ago. Thank you.
Mr. Allen, thank you very much. Secretary Weinberg, let me say that these two gentlemen happened to be on the program at a dinner I attended not long ago, and they were eloquent that night as well. But we welcome you, sir. You may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored, of course, to be called to testify before this committee on these very important questions and particularly important legislation that you're considering. I thought I'd just make a few brief remarks rather than a long formal statement, and would be glad to try to respond to questions that you might ask. The Taiwan Security Enhancement Act does seem to me to be one that is vitally needed now. And I'm going to look back to the August 17th communique, 1982, and then look forward to the act that you're considering. A great many people have taken the basic position, or seem to take the position, as Mr. Allen pointed out recently, that the communiques changed everything and constituted a binding promise on us not to carry out the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act by maintaining Taiwan's defensive position, but to reduce the amount of support we were going to supply to Taiwan down to, it got to be the point of zero. I think it should be clear, and then one of the best things about the Senate bill you're considering is that it makes it very clear that the communique does not override a statute, which should have been obvious to everyone, and that a communique cannot do anything other than do what it purports to do, which is a summary of talks that can never supersede or change the meaning of the Taiwan Relations Act or our basic policy. Communique is basically somewhat ambiguous, but it certainly does require us to keep on helping Taiwan maintain some kind of defensive capabilities, although it does have the basic thrust of going down to the 0 point on supplying those. As I think most people here particularly know, communiques are nearly always written before the meetings. Sometimes the meeting is basically simply so that the communique can be issued, and they don't purport to do anything other than summarize what the people drafting the communique from both sides rather hope will come out of the meeting. To the best of my knowledge, there was no Defense Department participation in the preparation of that communique, and it seemed to be, to my knowledge, at least it was promoted at the time, as being based on the assumption that the PRC itself would also greatly reduce its armaments and reduce its forces, and it had, of course, done neither, quite the contrary. So I don't think that we should be hampered by or felt that we are in any way bound by what is said by the communique, nor should we accept the argument that the communique sets the policy of the United States. I think we also have to consider China's changed attitudes. When I was Secretary of Defense, I made 2 or 3 trips there at their request, and they came over here, and we had a very well-established, healthy military-to-military relationship. It was because at that time what they most wanted was a defensive capability against the long 1,800-mile border they had with the then Soviet Union. And we worked with them to help improve in ways that they wanted their defensive capabilities. And it was basically consistent with our policies at the time. What has changed now in the last 2 or 3 years, or more than that, I guess about the last 4 or 5 years, is their apparent desires and goals with respect to their defense. They no longer seem to be nearly as interested in getting a defensive capability since the collapse of the Soviet Union as they are to get an offensive capability. They're getting the kinds of weapons that would be primarily of use in offensive operations. They've been very aggressive in their foreign policy, particularly with respect to the Spratly Islands and dropping their missiles in Taiwan's waters and various quite incendiary statements by their high officials. And they have been certainly acquiring nuclear and neutron bomb capabilities, some of which they had, some of which they're acquiring with American technologies acquired as detailed in the Cox report. They've also expressed vigorous anger at the renewal of the Japanese-U.S. Security Pact, which is a defensive pact, and it always makes me a little suspicious when anybody's very angry about it, the renewal of a defensive pact, because it makes me suspect that they might possibly have offensive intentions in mind, that the defensive pact would weaken. They've also expressed their fury at our working with Japan and Taiwan on missile defenses, despite the fact that they have a very large number of rockets aimed at Taiwan. And there's been a very heavy increase in both their arms and submarines facing Taiwan, as was pointed out in that extremely perceptive editorial from the Washington Post that was put into the record earlier today. So all of that, I think, emphasizes very strongly the need for the clarity and strength that is set out in the Helms bill. The Helms bill calls for lifting restrictions on arms sales, and I heard it criticized on that ground just a moment ago by the State Department representatives. It calls for ending the ban on high-level military exchanges, and that would certainly be welcome, because there's now an artificiality to that that even goes to the extent of requiring any of the Taiwan military officials to meet with the United States military officials in some kind of unofficial building instead of the Pentagon. It also, the bill provides for providing Taiwan with key weapon systems, including theater missile defense. I would hope that the high early warning radars would be included in that. All of this would make it much harder for the Chinese military to use or even to threaten force against Taiwan. President Lee's statements have been cited on all sides of all kinds of arguments recently, but what they do is simply recognize the facts as they are, the facts that there are two separate states now with a state-to-state relationship, and that the unification, which was emphasized, they repeated again in the statement of Mr. Gu, the head of their Trans-Straits negotiating committee, that the unification might come when China itself, the mainland, changes, but that has not been the case. It is not now the case. The forces that the PRC has created in China only emphasize, I think, China's aggressive intentions to win back Taiwan, and therefore Taiwan's need for support and clarification and help. And that's what I think the bill does that is before you, and why I think that bill should be enacted in the form in which it is now. Thank you very much, sir.
Secretary, thank you very much. Dr. Lampton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and share my views, and I'd ask that the full written testimony be included in the record.
It will.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The chairman of this committee has played a major role in developing the Taiwan Relations Act 20 years ago. And as everybody here has said, this has been a very successful piece of legislation. I think it served our country well and the people of Taiwan well. Therefore, it's with considerable forethought that I say that the proposed legislation will undo the good work of the Taiwan Relations Act. My areas of concern with respect to S-693 fall into 6 areas. And I would like to associate myself with the remarks at the start of the hearing by Senator Biden and Senator Baucus. My first concern is that the TRA, in conjunction with the 3 communiques and other statements and correspondence, has provided a very successful framework for managing a complicated and sensitive three-way relationship. The proposed legislation is therefore unnecessary. The 20 years since adoption of the TRA have witnessed enormous progress on Taiwan, and I won't bore you with it all. With respect to the cross-strait security, however, while there are worries, and these are legitimate worries, including China's naval and air force and missile modernization, there's also progress in cross-strait security to report. Put bluntly, if security were perceived to be so tenuous on Taiwan and cross-strait ties so perilous, why is it that 40,000 Taiwan firms have contracted $40 billion of investment on the mainland? Why is it that 1/3 of Taiwan's total information industry output is produced in plants located on the mainland? The proposed legislation also is unnecessary because considerable authority proposed in 693 already exists in the TRA, particularly with respect to defensive weapons sales. Further, the premise that weapons sales have been inadequate is undermined by the figures on past and current arms sales and delivery to Taiwan, which I provide in my testimony. These sales and deliveries have included F-16s, the Patriot missile, Perry and Knox-class frigates, and most recently early warning radars and aircraft parts. Indeed, many of the analysts in our U.S. Defense Department and elsewhere in the security community in Washington argue that Taiwan's biggest problem is absorbing and maintaining weapons and training an adequate number of personnel to use the equipment already provided. Figures provided in my written testimony show that 1997 FMS foreign military sales deliveries were 8.5 times bigger than the 1981 level in constant 1982 dollars. Second, as I mentioned to President Lee Teng-hui when I had the opportunity to meet with him on June 24th of this year, in order to achieve comprehensive security, we need to focus not simply on military prowess and hardware, as important as those are, but also on the incentives for Beijing to avoid employing coercion. Conceding that there is an important role for deterrence, we need to ask why Beijing has not, for the most part, exerted force against Taiwan during the last 3 decades. An important part of that answer lies in U.S. military power and credibility, as well as the limitations on Beijing's own power. But this is only part of the answer. The more comprehensive explanation is that there's been a balanced framework of 3 considerations in Beijing's calculus. First, the United States must be credible and constant. Beijing launched missiles in 95 and 96 in part because Washington wasn't credible, either in terms of observing past agreements and understanding with the PRC or in terms of meeting military threats against Taiwan. Second, Beijing must believe that time is not working against eventual reunification. And third, Beijing must have a stake in a positive framework of cooperation with America that makes coercion very expensive to its interests. Frankly, the proposed legislation, in my view, upsets this delicate balance among these 3 considerations by giving the PRC less of a stake in good relations with the United States and by signaling to many in China that time is eroding any possibility of reunification. Most fundamentally, I believe Beijing will initiate conflict, even knowing it will lose, rather than acquiesce to an independent Taiwan. Third, the proposed legislation would amount to a substantial restoration of the 1954 Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan and therefore be inconsistent with a cornerstone of the normalization agreements of December 1978. Further, at the same time that America must seek to deter the use of force by the PRC, and I do think we're all very concerned to do that, the United States also must discourage Taipei from so taking U.S. military support for granted that various political forces on the island feel they can change the status quo with impunity and drag the United States into conflict. Fourth concern. Another area relates to the bill's provisions with respect to theater missile defense. To be talking about, quote, authorizing, end quote, the provision of upper tier, presumably high altitude systems that have not yet gone beyond testing or the drawing board is both premature and it is unwise. It is premature because usually before encouraging weapons sales, we want to fully understand what we're proposing to transfer, both in terms of the level of technology and the obligations it may impose on the United States. The bill's provisions are unwise because if enacted, those provisions would accelerate the already worrisome growth of short-range and other missiles in the PRC and provide an incentive for a regional arms race. Fifth, the timing of this bill is particularly unfortunate given the convergence of the following developments: the uproar over President Lee Teng-hui's July 9th remarks, the already deteriorated state of U.S.-China relations in the wake of the mistaken bombing of the Belgrade embassy, and the very unfortunate and I think reprehensible anti-American violence in the aftermath of that tragedy. Sixth, therefore, at this moment in U.S.-China-Taiwan relations, Washington ought to be pursuing available opportunities to enhance the security and welfare of all the people involved. Here I have in mind Beijing and Taipei's accession to the World Trade Organization. Once both the mainland and Taiwan are in the WTO, each will have obligations to conduct its economic relations with the other according to international norms and in more efficient ways than now possible. So my principal recommendation is just very simple. Let's concentrate our efforts in directions for the moment that foster positive interaction. There's plenty of time to consider other alternatives should they prove advisable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Woolsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be part of this distinguished panel, and I appreciate the Chairman's and staff's indulgence in view of the fact I've just returned to town and letting me testify extemporaneously from notes. I'll be about the same length as the previous speakers, if that's all right. I support the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act, Mr. Chairman. I believe that under current circumstances, this package is a reasonable one. The increase in staff at the American Institute in Taiwan, the required presidential report on Taiwan defense requests, the reassertion of the primacy of the Taiwan Relations Act over the 1982 communique about arms sales, the enhancement of operational training and exercises, the establishment of secure communications channels between the U.S. and Taiwan military commands, and the authorization, not the mandating, of certain arms sales. It gives me some pause, I must admit, that this list is somewhat detailed. I served as General Counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee under Senator Stennis and have served 3 times as a presidential appointee in the Defense Department, the State Department, and the intelligence community in both Republican and Democratic administrations. And frankly, I can teach this issue of executive versus congressional prerogatives in the foreign policy arena either round or flat. But I'm generally of the view that detailed implementation is best left to the executive. There may be 1 or 2 aspects of this bill that it would be wise to compromise on as the committee deliberates and the process moves forward. But I'm also quite aware that Lord Bryce said that in this arena of foreign policy, the United States Constitution is essentially an invitation to struggle. And in my judgment, where, as here, the executive branch's policy is both wrong-headed and dangerous, Congress has a duty to the country to try to correct it. And I believe that is what you are trying to do with this bill. The current situation is, I believe, dangerous. There has been much commentary about the Washington Post editorial this morning. I, too, would endorse it. The PRC has been sending modern fighter aircraft into the Straits, recently seized a Taiwanese ship, fired its new ballistic missile, the DF-31, on which, as someone put it, U.S. taxpayers should perhaps be receiving licensing fees. This has followed the staged managed damage by bust-in crowds to attack the United States Embassy in Beijing, a massive crackdown on the threat posed, as Beijing sees it, by middle-aged people who like to do breathing exercises, and the brutal sentencing of those who seek to organize true democracy for China. I would submit that although the triggering incidents leading to this series of events seem diverse, our tragic mistake in bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, President Lee Teng-hui's comment about state-to-state relations being the proper basis for PRC-Taiwan negotiations, and the silent demonstration in Beijing by the Falun Gong sect, the underlying sources of the PRC's behavior are, I believe, essentially two. One, fear of potential political unrest stemming from economic change in China, and two, U.S. policy itself. First, the disestablishment of the large state-owned enterprises in China over the long run will bring some economic freedoms, I believe, that will quite possibly help change China and Chinese society and make it more conducive over time to political freedoms as well. But in the short run, the unemployment from the disestablishment of those enterprises can lead to substantial instability, and the temptation for any autocracy or dictatorship in the event of fearing instability is often to play the card of nationalism. Nationalism is most conveniently, by Beijing, directed against Taiwan. I believe that it would be excellent if we could see normal trade relations between the United States and China. I was sorry to see the administration delay some months ago the negotiations over the WTO, especially in light of Zhu Rongji's efforts to compromise. In light of some of the criticisms that I am making of the administration for being too lenient with the PRC, in my judgment, I believe that with respect to the WTO negotiations, it has been too rigid. It is almost as if the administration were taking a leaf from Bishop Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done. Now, second, although in the above instance, I think the administration offered insufficient encouragement to Zhu Rongji and other reformers by its negotiating tactics, many steps, particularly regarding Taiwan, the administration has essentially appeased the PRC. There really is no other word for it. And thus, in effect, I believe it has encouraged policies of hard-line factions in the PRC, particularly with respect to Taiwan. I think the administration has done this by reversing its campaign criticism of the Bush administration for being too accommodating to the, quote, butchers of Tiananmen. It has declared a strategic partnership with Beijing, a phrase that, given the military source and meaning of the word strategic, the vast majority of people would interpret as meaning a de facto military alliance. The President has echoed in his statement in China Beijing's formulation of the three no's without clearly at the same time spelling out that it would be unacceptable for the PRC to use force in the Taiwan Straits. The administration has subordinated relations with the region's democracies, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, by acquiescing to PRC pressure, for example, that the President not even visit Japan on his trip last year to the PRC. The President's spoken favorably of the PRC takeover of Hong Kong as a model for relations between the PRC and Taiwan. The administration has severely restricted arms sales, even, I think, of clearly defensive systems to Taiwan. And it has, instead of apologizing once, clearly, for the tragic bombing of the PRC embassy in Belgrade, it has apologized so many times at so many levels and so effusively that it has demeaned the currency of diplomatic communications on such a subject. I believe that the administration also, in some ways most tragically, has maintained a strategic ambiguity about whether or not the United States would protect Taiwan if it were attacked by the PRC. And a number of these steps, somewhat recent ones, have undercut the laudable, if somewhat delayed, dispatch of the two aircraft carriers to the waters near Taiwan in 1996 at the time of the last crisis. Mr. Chairman, I believe this is a very dangerous stance by the President and the administration, potentially even a tragic stance. When dictatorships see prey, such as, for example, Germany viewed Czechoslovakia in 1938, they need to be deterred in order for peace to be protected. The sort of ambiguity the administration espouses was the heart of Britain's and France's position with respect to Germany's eastern neighbors in the 1930s. Needless to say, that policy of ambiguity did not work well. Probably no one was more surprised than Hitler when the indecisive Western governments that abandoned Czechoslovakia stood by Poland in 1939 and World War II began. And the ambiguity of a number of European powers' guarantees to one another in 1914 famously contributed to the outbreak of World War I. Taiwan's status as prey is sharpened in the PRC's eyes because of the island's democratic reforms of recent years. As a vibrant and prosperous democracy with political and economic freedom, Taiwan constitutes an affront to Beijing. It is living, breathing proof that the self-serving nonsense put out by some autocratic and dictatorial leaders that Asian values are inconsistent with democracy is quite false. Taiwan is an affront to the PRC in the same way that Solidarity Poland was an affront to the USSR. I take the administration's points in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, that military sales are not everything, and that good U.S.-PRC relations redound to Taiwan's benefit. And I also acknowledge that President Lee Teng-hui's recent remarks, departing from the fictitious but diplomatically useful one China formulation, have given Beijing an excuse for saber-rattling. It's worth noting that one of the most skillful and successful diplomats in history, Talleyrand, once said that language was given to man to conceal thought. And however understandable President Lee's comments were in the light of Taiwan's vigorous and free political debate, I would advance the somewhat old-fashioned notion that there are some things best left unsaid by those at the top of government, and I believe that was one of them. He even exceeded what most of the leaders of the opposition party, whose platform supports independence, have been saying in recent years, which is that since independence is a reality, one does not need to speak of it. But the key point, Mr. Chairman, came up in your questioning of Assistant Secretary Roth. The best way, in my view, to have sound relations with a nation like China, the PRC today, is not to be, as you put it, a nervous Nelly. We need to be polite and diplomatic, I believe. We need to acknowledge and reward efforts to work with us, such as those that Zhirongji made on the WTO negotiations. But over the long run, it is very dangerous to meet the aggressive moves of dictatorships against their potential prey with appeasement. Appeasement may buy you some time in the short run. Chamberlain was sure that the sellout of Czechoslovakia at Munich in 1938 would bring peace in our time. It did, but his time only lasted 1 year. I believe that clear, not ambiguous, American support for Taiwan's right to be protected from the use of force by Beijing is an essential part of maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait. The administration has turned instead to appeasement and ambiguity. In the interest of peace, the executive branch needs to be brought up short and forced to change what is, I believe, its very short-sighted policy. This bill can help bring that about, and I would urge that Congress move forward with it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Four very interesting witnesses. Very colorful. Yes, sir. We have another vote in about 15 minutes. And I'm going to ask one question only, and I'd like for any of you to answer. I've had several of my friends signal me that they like my bill, our bill, Torricella's and mine. But they say, don't you think that you're provoking the ire of Beijing? And my retort was that I would be astonished if I didn't. I didn't want to send them a love letter. I want them to understand that at least there's one senator who feels that they've gone far enough to then kick it around a very fine, independent free enterprise government. Now, I don't dispute anything about Beijing's frowning upon it, but my question is, how would you propose that we manage the predictable verbal outrage that will come from Beijing if and when this bill is passed and implement its provisions? Mr. Allen, Mr. Weinberg, I don't know whether Dr. Lampton will participate in this or not, but...
Mr. Chairman, if I just may respond briefly, I had some experience of being shouted at by Deng Xiaoping in the Great Hall of the People in 1980 when George Bush and I went there. I would say that we have had an unending torrent of abuse, threats, and imprecations from the People's Republic of China over many years, and we simply listen to that, we reject that which is absolutely outrageous, and we simply don't respond in kind. Of course there will be a torrent of abuse. There always is. But the torrent of abuse in terms of future mistreatment of Taiwan will be infinitely worse if we don't take some action to shore up the administration's dangerously deficient policies.
Weinberg?
Well, there are many ways we could respond to the torrent of abuse that is undoubtedly going to flow. We did, I think, the proper thing with the Japan-U.S. security agreement, Senator. We ignored it. With the Japan-U.S. security agreement, Senator, we ignored it. We paid no attention to the fact that they objected to our renewing that defense agreement. I hope we will continue that policy of ignoring their objections to our working with Taiwan and Japan on missile defense, which I think we need urgently. There's one third course, which I took, which may not be recommended. I was being given when I was over there at their request, working with them to improve their defenses. I was given the standard Taiwan lecture, which is about 45 minutes, and they said I made the most effective response they'd ever seen to it. I fell asleep. So that I think that you are going to have to expect this torrent of abuse, and I think we have to ignore it because we cannot allow our policy to be dictated or formed by objections that will come from, I think, a totally unfounded way from this kind of regime.
Thank you. Dr. Lamb?
I think we not only have to be prepared for our response, but we have to think what response we're going to ask the Taiwan people to have to make. And I think just objectively speaking, we're going to see capital flight. We're going to see less investment and economic growth in Taiwan. We're going to see higher taxes. And as much as I'm worried about our response, it's in the end the people of Taiwan that are 95 miles to 100 miles off the shore of China. And I'm more worried about their response and what they can do than us. We've got lots of options. My concern about this bill is the people of Taiwan. And it's their response and their options that I think are going to be jeopardized. Thank you.
I would smile, be friendly and businesslike, work as closely as they are willing to with them on WTO membership and trade matters, and go right about our business. I would not shift as a result of the invective that is sure to come. The invective is worse and will be worse because of a number of the indirect encouragements that they've been given over the course of the last several years, I think, by the administration's behavior. But one has to stop sometime, or it's a continued downhill slope. So I think we just have to sort of take it and proceed to try to work with them on whatever we can work with them on.
Thank you, gentlemen. Joe?
Thank you. Mr. Allen and Secretary Weinberger, do you think that Mr. Woolsey is correct and that we should move forward with WTO with the Chinese?
I do.
With the PRC? Do you,
I think that when the necessary conditions have been established in mainland China that we have been talking about, it would be acceptable to do that, yes. I think that
But they don't exist now, do they?
They do not exist now.
So right now, you would not, in other words, you don't think the President made a mistake in not going forward with
I don't want to go that far, Senator. I think he made a mistake in leading them right up to the well and thinking he was going to let them drink from it. And then he backed away at the very last minute after they had made some concessions, which, of course, now they've completely withdrawn. It may have been that if those concessions had been accepted, that the conditions would have changed sufficiently so that we could go ahead with it. But I think that the fault was twofold. It was the fact that they did not change the conditions, but also the fact that we gave, through President Clinton, gave them every reason to believe that they would have the opportunity to enter.
I don't know of three people who know this town and Congress better than the three of you, and I don't know where you all were when this was going on. Any of you think that the President of the United States could have successfully concluded the WTO negotiations, no matter what the Chinese said, in the light of the, quote, stealing of all of our secrets? You all are, with due respect, rookies and not the pros I think you are. I remember getting a phone call from a high administration official saying they think they can move this deal and close it. What did I think the Congress would do if they did? And I said I thought the Congress would crucify them, and there would be such a backlash that you would not see, you'd see relations push back. I don't know where you guys have been. You might have been out of town during that period. But if anyone who wants to go on record as saying you think if you were heading the administration that you could have pushed through a WTO that could be purchased up here and bought, I'd like you to go on record and tell me.
Well, Senator, let me suggest to you that the Chinese offered a number of concessions only because they had been encouraged by Mr. Clinton to believe that they were going to be admitted to the WTO.
Well, that's correct.
And so under those circumstances,
but in the meantime,
you certainly would not want to go ahead with it if they were not going to keep those concessions, and then no one understood whether they were or not. So I was in town, if you ask where I was.
In the meantime, there was a little bit of a flap that occurred in town here. I don't think you guys are being fair about that part of it. I think I respect your position on your disagreement with this administration's relationship with the PRC as it relates to Taiwan. I respect that, and I think you make some valid points. I think, you know, the only thing you didn't bring out was the umbrella. You're a very colorful fellow, Mr. Wood. You are to foreign policy what the former, with Griffin Bell has become to constitutional policy. And that's a high compliment. It's a high compliment. But I don't disagree I don't take issue with your grave concern about where this administration is listing, limping, moving, however you want to characterize it. But I think I think it's a little exaggerated to suggest that there could have been the possibility of, at any rate. But anyway, I have a number of questions. I won't take your time now. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just make one. Senator Biden, you have a point about the confluence of the issuance of the Cox Committee report and the strong public and congressional feeling about the WTO. But that very confluence was a result of some 4 or 5 months of delay within the administration in declassifying the Cox Committee report. If that had been done promptly, one would have had a 4 or 5 months period before Zhirongji came here. So I think there was more in the control of the administration than that, but I think you do have a point with respect to the timing, the way it worked out with the Cox Committee report and the WTO negotiations. It would have been a very bold move indeed, given all that had happened at that point, but I still rest my case.
Which may have succeeded with political courage and the ability to...
You all know Jesse Helms?
Yes, sir.
Senator, I'm tempted to point out to you that admission to the WTO could be considered in some quarters as suitable punishment for China.
Well, by the way, I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you, but anyway, thank you for your testimony. Senator Coverdale.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions. I compliment the panel for their remarks, very insightful. The entire day has been. I think this panel has probably more accurately reflected the level of risk than some of the previous panelists have, and have underscored the severe complexity and danger that we are confronted with right now. And I appreciate the chairman having called this group together, appreciate the panelists, and there's the vote, and so I did it exactly right.
Yes, sir. Gentlemen, there goes the voting light. We got, I didn't see you come back in.
I snuck back in on you.
Apologize.
Okay.
Thank you.
Proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You weren't here when I praised your concern and expressed my sincere sympathy for the feelings that I think and concerns that motivate you to bring this legislation. I didn't embrace it in its entirety, but I think something short of it might conceivably be of interest. And I just wanted to sort that out a little bit with this very distinguished panel, and I welcome all of you back here. Appreciate your input on this very, very much. One point of view is obviously that we can go ahead and do this, create this relationship that in a sense would codify what most people express both privately and in their ambiguity language is really the reality of our relationship is, which is anything less than a peaceful transition is unacceptable. And that's the policy. If that's true, this would in effect state that in a more clear way, which is what the Washington Post in effect said we should do somehow. The question is obviously what are the implications of that? I mean, do we trigger something that we then regret? Do we create greater instability, which is what Dr. Lampton has been suggesting we might create? And is there something short of that which might accomplish the goals without the downsides, if there are any? Why, address, if you would, perhaps each of you, the sort of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it comment we've heard several times today. Now, I agree with all of you. I think the administration is coming, and not all of you, because not everybody's expressed it, three of you, that they're coming up a little short in this relationship right now. And anybody who doesn't acknowledge that is glossing over some realities that are dangerous. But at the same time, we've gone through 3 decades of a balance between Taiwan and the PRC that seems to have, in effect, worked, although it's now entering a more complicated stage. Why not find less I mean, maybe the word provocative is too strong, but why not find less in-your-face ways of perhaps clarifying and strengthening without necessarily upsetting that balance of 30 years. Does that concern you at all, Mr. Secretary Weinberger? And then I'll come to Mr. Allen, Mr. Woolsey.
Yes, sir. Senator, I think it's a very good question, and I would put to you the fact that I think an act of this kind is needed because the President of the United States in June of 1998 went to China, went to Beijing, as Mr. Woolsey correctly pointed out, didn't even bother to stop at Japan on the way. Spent 9 or 10 days there, and during the course of that, he upset the very carefully constructed, artificial, if you like, formulas in the Taiwan Relations Act. The Taiwan Relations Act said that we do not challenge the fact that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is part of China. We understand that. We understand that all parties argue that. In Beijing, in June of 1998, Mr. Clinton said that we don't support independence for Taiwan. We don't support the idea that there are 2 Chinas or 1 Taiwan and 1 China. And he went further and said, we don't believe that Taiwan should be a member in any organization for which statehood is a requirement. So he adopted all of the PRC demands, gave up our very carefully constructed mechanisms and ideas that we understood both their claims, but we weren't associating ourselves with either one, and did it in a single speech for which we got absolutely nothing over there. It was, I think, a performance that the Washington Post characterized quite correctly. I keep noting with great approval the Washington Post today. They said in classic Clinton fashion, the White House tries to have things both ways, denying that U.S. policy has changed, when in fact it has, and not for the better. And they concluded, Mr. Clinton has sided with the dictators against the Democrats. To pretend that this is no change would only... When you have that kind of a sea change, Senator Kerry, I think you need a clarification, a clearing up that is provided for in this act to make it very clear that we are going to continue doing what was done under the TRA, before the communique and after the communique, and that we're going to do it on a much more specific basis, because the Chinese People's Republic armaments and threatening postures make it necessary to be more specific. So that's why I think we need the bill.
Very briefly, Senator, you mentioned the delicate balance. We're about to...
Can I ask you both? I don't want to use the light. Is that all right? Maybe you'd address this, because I think it'd be helpful for the record, et cetera. In the joint communique of August 17th, 1982, our Section 5 says, the United States government attaches great importance to its relations with China and reiterates it has no intention of infringing on Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity or interfering in China's internal affairs or pursuing a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. I'm having trouble understanding why what the President did, with the exception of the three no's might go further. But other than that, aren't they one and the same?
He accepted not only the three no's, but he also accepted the fact that a communique could override a statute. And that's what I find particularly troublesome.
Yes, my answer is the same, Senator, essentially. But you mentioned the word balance. And my concern is that we're about to become imbalanced, that the dynamics have changed. In that connection, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I would like to have introduced to the record a recent study by Richard Fisher entitled Dynamic Elements in the Cross-Straits Military Balance, if there would
be acceptable. Unanimous consent.
Second thing I would like to point out very briefly is that I read, to my great consternation just yesterday, I was out of the country along with Secretary Weinberger, as a matter of fact, a report in the Washington Times in which Admiral Dennis Blair, U.S. Pacific Commander-in-Chief, who was on my staff in the Reagan administration as a young naval officer, said that we shouldn't defend Taiwan if we should declare its independence. He said that Taiwan was, quote, the TURD in the punch bowl of U.S.-China relations, and that if Taiwan were to declare independence, I don't think we should support them at all. Now, this is not administration talk, but it's the kind of things that upset, the kind of thing that upsets people, and certainly would give the Taiwanese great pause. These kinds of, if this is an accurate remark, it's an inflammatory remark, and it just heightens the sensitivity of the Congress, the Senate and the House, and demonstrates that the administration is simply not clear in its policies.
Understood. Yeah. You're raising your hand, Dr. Lamb. Did you want to respond?
I just wanted to address, you were asking what could be done to clarify things without necessarily pursuing this legislation. And I'd make three very clear statements. I think some clarifications needed. I'd first of all say, as Speaker Gingrich said when he went, no force, period. That'd be the end of that statement. Secondly, no unilateral independence with U.S. support. I'd be equally clear in stating that. And finally, get talking and start confidence-building measures. And that'd be the clarification I'd be looking for.
Yeah. Well, we're on the back end of a vote, and I don't want to abuse the process. Let me just say that I think, Mr. Chairman, I think that this is timely, obviously, but it's very important to have this contribution, and I think we really need to think hard about how we're going to pursue a different course than the one we're on now, which I think is adding to the ambiguities and, frankly, ultimately the instabilities.
Senator King, maybe just a couple of sentences. Well, sorry.
Excuse me.
I was just going to respond to the 30 years balance, and it ain't broke, don't fix it. The 30 years, most of the 30 years, we had one communist dictatorship and one autocracy. And in that circumstance, things could be more or less stable, at least after '69. But changes in the PRC, the economic changes, which I described, and democratization in Taiwan, leading to statements indirectly, such as President Lee Teng-hui's, has changed the situation, and it makes it harder for Taiwan, and it makes it harder for China, and it makes it harder for us, because our foreign policy is always a mixture of realpolitik and Wilsonianism, and this is now a democracy. These are our folks, and that makes it harder.
A very good point, but isn't part of the realpolitik also that if you overly link and overly raise expectations, you create a capacity for some, conceivably in Taiwan, to then say, okay, they're so close to us now and so tied in, we're declaring our independence because they can't do anything about it. And you've, in fact, invited a greater potential for that confrontation and viability. I mean, it's exactly that very dicey balance that we've walked to avoid.
It's exactly that tightrope.
And we create an umbrella that we don't mean to create.
That tightrope we were on for a while, and my fear anyway is that the administration is tilted rather hard to falling off the tightrope in one direction.
Secretary Weinberger, you have the last word.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I know you're properly trying to get back to vote, but let me just make one point that I think is critical here. If there is the slightest feeling on the part of the PRC that we would not support Taiwan, that all of this mixing words and metaphors and going back and forth and communiques and all the rest would lead them to believe that we would not support Taiwan if Taiwan were attacked, is the most dangerous thing that we could be doing. And that's why I think it's essential to have a bill like this passed that would make it very clear that we would not only never put Taiwan in that position, but that China should never be under the slightest misapprehension that that might occur. That's why I think it's so vital that this kind of debate be held, which I compliment the committee on having.
Could I ask one question, Paul? I think it's a very important one.
Go ahead.
Let's assume we go the road you say, and I agree we got to change the balance a little. But if we did that, would you be willing to accept the notion that you say, we will defend you if you're attacked, but if you declare independence unilaterally, don't count on us? Can that be done?
No, I don't think so, Senator, because I don't think we're in any position to dictate to a country such as Taiwan that has been a very good friend of ours and is independent in almost every sense, what they can or can't do. We cannot decide for them whether they'll go for independence.
But we can decide whether or not young Americans are going to be sucked into something.
The important thing strategically is not to have Taiwan overrun by the People's Republic and the world know that the United States doesn't stand by its allies.
Good discussion.
Got to stop sometime. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming. I wish we could go 2 more hours. Maybe we can do that sometime. There'd be no further.